This is Trauma-Informed Care, Best Practices for a Trauma-Informed Approach for Disability and Sexual Violence Service Providers. This project was supported by the Education, Training, and Enhanced Services to End Violence Against Women with Disabilities Grants Program, awarded by the Office of Violence Against Women, U.S. Department of Justice. The opinions, findings, and recommendations expressed in this publication are those of the author and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Department of Justice, Office of Violence Against Women. My name is Carrie Utese. I go by she and her. My job title is Sexual Violence Response Coordinator, and I work at the Arizona Coalition to End Sexual and Domestic Violence. My email is there on the screen, should you ever need to reach me. So at ACESDV, our mission is to end sexual and domestic violence in Arizona by dismantling oppression and promoting equity among all people. This is the lens that we look through when we talk about sexual violence or domestic violence. So my job, I'm a trainer. That's really what my job is. Here's some of the trainings that we do currently. The other part of my job is technical assistance, which is helping organizations with hard cases or community connections or just supporting them as they need. And I don't know everything, but if I don't know the thing that you ask, I am dedicated to finding the right person when it's not me. We do have email lists. If you'd like to join the email list, just send me an email and ask. So hopefully everybody can hear me okay. But most importantly, this presentation may contain information and topics that are uncomfortable. You're encouraged to take care of yourself however you need. This is a recording, so feel free to pause or take time away or end the recording should you need. If you have questions when we're done, please email me. Ask those questions. I welcome them. And for our interpreters, let me know if I'm speaking too quickly. And when you have questions, please email me however you feel comfortable. This training is for you. So I might be saying things that you're already aware of. And if I'm wrong about something, please send me an email and correct me. And if you'd like a certificate of completion, all you have to do is email me to ask. There will be a training evaluation. Make sure that you fill this out. So hopefully we can all agree that everyone deserves freedom from harassment, discrimination, and victimization. Hopefully we can all agree that victimization or crimes are never a victim's fault. And we believe people. Being uncomfortable is when learning happens. Try to stay in a growth mindset. And again, please ask those questions when you have them. I'm here for you. This training is going to talk about oppression, trauma, and trauma-informed care as a service provider. We're going to start with oppression and the root causes of violence. And in order to talk about oppression, we also have to talk about intersectionality. So the term intersectionality was created in 1989 by Kimberly Williams Crenshaw to describe the overlapping of human circumstance and how it complicates the experience of discrimination. Intersectionality impacts the way a person experiences the world and the way the world perceives them. For social justice movements, reminding us that if we do not think broadly and holistically about the interplay of multiple identities, our movements cannot succeed. This is also a particular term for the legal field, which expanded to society at large due to many systems having the need for this terminology. When we talk about intersections, we are thinking about race, religion, sexuality, ethnicity, age, ability, or disability as well. So, for example, this is a person that we made up. This person identifies as female, identifies as bisexual, is dyslexic, is Black, and college educated. And when we talk about this person, we have to look at them as a whole person, including all of these different intersections. And when we talk about survivors, we have to look at them as a whole person as well. Oppression is when certain groups of people are treated unfairly and kept from having the same opportunities as others. The unfair treatment happens throughout society, affecting many areas of life. Some people get special advantages, and others are controlled and treated badly because they're seen as less valuable. Those who are pushed to the edges of society often miss out on important resources and opportunities because of this unfair system. The goal of oppression is to hurt and exploit those who are vulnerable and solidify the power of the privileged. At the root of sexual violence is power. And there can be a sexual component to sexual violence, but most people commit sexual violence to gain power. The other piece at the root of sexual violence is oppression. People use sexual violence to commit oppression, to oppress someone. They don't generally commit sexual violence just for sexual pleasure. It's to hurt someone, oppress them, show power over top of them, and altogether show that they're superior. We use this Venn diagram a lot. Most victims are targeted. So there's a myth that sexual violence is committed by someone who is hiding in a bush and jumps out at a stranger. And while that can happen, most of the time, a sexual violence perpetrator is waiting to find someone who they have easy access to, who they can easily discredit, and who is vulnerable to sexual violence. And the people at the center of that Venn diagram are the most victimized. Next, we're going to talk about trauma. There's a definition of trauma, and one of them is a deeply distressing or disturbing experience. Emotional shock following a stressful event or physical injury. Or, medically, they talk about physical injuries as trauma as well. And which of these might a sexual violence survivor experience? We think it's potentially all three. But, trauma is not the event. It's how the body reacts to the event. A traumatic event is an event or series of events which causes an amount of stress that the body cannot handle. So when we talk about types of traumatic events, we can talk about things like accidents, domestic violence, sexual assault, war, immigration, racism, or really any of these things. Neglect, chronic illness, infertility. And this is not an exhaustive list. There's many other things that can come and be traumatic for a person. The types of trauma, we break into 3 categories of acute, complex, or chronic. So if a trauma event is acute, it's resulting from a single incident. If it's complex, it means the exposure to varied and multiple traumatic events. And if it's complex, these events are generally invasive and interpersonal. Chronic trauma is repeated, prolonged, for example, domestic abuse. When we talk about trauma, we need to think about what happens to our body. We do have a natural stress response, and everyone defaults to thinking about fight or flight, so wanting to fight or wanting to run. Most sexual violence survivors experience freeze as their trauma response to sexual violence, and potentially fawn, which is a stress response to try to please someone to avoid conflict. A fawn response might look like agreeing with someone even when you disagree, constantly apologizing, doing things that you don't want to do, excessive flattery, avoiding saying no, suppressing your own needs, or being still during a sexual assault. Our brains are made up of 3 different parts: the neocortex, the top rational and thinking brain, the limbic brain, which is where we keep our emotions or our feelings, and then sometimes referred to as the reptilian brain. This is the part that does the important stuff, instinctual or dinosaur brain. So in the neocortex, we think about planning and anticipation, sense of time and context, inhibition and judgment, empathic understanding, language and abstract thought, and in the mammalian brain or the limbic system brain, this is where we experience emotions and memories. And our brain stem, the reptilian brain, is where we have basic housekeeping things like breathing, eating, arousal, fight or flight, chemical balance, and also defecating or urinating. We're going to talk specifically about the limbic system brain. So we have a few different parts there: the hypothalamus, the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the thalamus. The thalamus is a relay station for incoming motor and sensory information. It's where we have things like hearing, taste, sight, and touch. And the amygdala interprets emotional significance. So our fight or flight response, it happens in our brain here. Here's a little flow chart of how that happens. During our fight or flight response, the hypothalamus ultimately has a few different pathways that end up releasing hormones into our bloodstream. And then those hormones activate everything else in our body. So, for example, it can cause fast breathing, muscle tension, bladder relaxation, slow digestion, dilated pupils, and so on. I am going to play a video next. And this video is a good explanation of how that process is.
Welcome to 2-Minute Neuroscience, where I explain neuroscience topics in 2 minutes or less. In this installment, I will discuss the HPA axis. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal, or HPA, axis is best known for its role in our body's reaction to stress. The HPA axis includes a group of hormone-secreting glands from the nervous and endocrine systems, the hypothalamus, pituitary gland, and adrenal glands. The hypothalamus is a small neuroendocrine structure situated just above the brainstem that controls the release of hormones from the pituitary gland, a hormone-secreting gland that sits just below the hypothalamus. The pituitary gland can release hormones into the bloodstream to reach a variety of targets. In the case of the HPA axis, hormones released from the pituitary gland travel down to the kidneys and influence the secretion of hormones from endocrine glands called the adrenal glands, which sit on top of the kidneys. The primary function of the HPA axis is to regulate the stress response. When we experience something stressful, the hypothalamus releases a hormone called corticotropin-releasing hormone, or CRH. CRH signals the pituitary gland to secrete a hormone called adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, into the bloodstream. ACTH travels down to the adrenal glands where it prompts the release of a hormone called cortisol from the cortex or outer layer of the adrenal glands. The release of cortisol causes a number of changes that help the body to deal with stress. For example, it helps to mobilize energy like glucose, so the body has enough energy to cope with a prolonged stressor. When cortisol levels in the blood get high, this is sensed by receptors in areas of the brain like the hypothalamus and hippocampus, which leads to the shutting off of the stress response through what is known as a negative feedback mechanism.
So hopefully that makes sense. What we want to get out of that is knowing that the body does weird things when there's stress, and essentially shutting down is one of the things that it does. 75% of sexual assault victims experience moderate to high levels of tonic immobility during a sexual assault. And that's where they don't move their bodies. Victims might also experience dissociation or collapsed immobility where they can only move a little bit, which is, it has partial or full loss of consciousness, fainting, trembling, weakness, or loss of memory of the event. So when people do report, there's a lot of fear of retaliation. So maybe losing financial support, losing caregivers, shelter, or taking away mobility devices. Survivors might also not recall the event, or they might take time to remember it later. They might not have access to effective communication or the accommodations to report. There's a lot of things that people say that are victim blaming. For example, why didn't you fight? Or how could you have missed that? And we want to make sure we avoid those victim blaming phrases because, as we just learned, the body shuts itself down during stressful events. So there are some traumatic impacts of sexual violence. For example, there's a physical impact. It impacts the whole body. It can cause chronic pain, fatigue or exhaustion, gastrointestinal disorders, migraines or frequent headaches, It can cause eating disorders, and it can cause substance use or substance dependence. And if people had previous health issues, they might be exacerbated after a sexual assault. It can also cause people to be suicidal, and people might avoid healthcare. Psychologically, it can also impact someone long term with shame and blame, irritability, emotional numbness. People might have trouble sleeping or nightmares. They might be hypervigilant, which means if they're, at the grocery store, they might think that person might hurt me. Or if they're going on dates, they might think that person's going to hurt me. They might feel depressed or have anxiety or fear. They might be showing symptoms of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, or flashbacks. They might have low self-esteem, maybe ongoing for a long time. They may have difficulty with sex or sexuality. They might feel hopeless. And they may self-isolate. With people who have disabilities, there's a lot of barriers to reporting that victimization. For example, individuals with cognitive disabilities might not even recognize their experience that it was a crime. There might be a lack of knowledge about healthy sexuality in general. They may have language or communication barriers. They may be nonverbal. People might have a fear of not being believed or being blamed. They may have a fear of retaliation. They might have a fear of being placed into a new facility or having a new care environment, or a fear of having to receive new unknown caregivers. People might lose their autonomy or be afraid of that. So they might be more isolated. They might require more supervision or restrictions. They may feel guilt about filing charges, and they might be financially dependent on the person who abuses them. There's also lots of disbelief in successful prosecution. People have complex trauma experiences. They might be physically vulnerable. There's an emotional impact of having a disability in general. There's less access to support services. They may feel more social isolation, and they might have pre-existing trauma from having that disability. They may have experienced a life of dependency on caregivers. They may have communication challenges. Plus, they've experienced stigma and discrimination and widespread ableism. Next, we're going to talk about providing trauma-informed care and understanding our role with working with individuals. So trauma-informed care is an approach to care that acknowledges that survivors carry trauma not just from their sexual violence experience, but also their lived experiences from facing both subtle and overt forms of oppression throughout their life. When we work with individuals, the goal is to avoid re-traumatizing them and not exacerbate their trauma symptoms, but instead cultivate an environment full of empathy, safety, and healing. A healing-centered framework builds upon trauma-informed care. So the paradigm shift that we need to have is, instead of thinking, what's wrong with you? We want to think, what has happened to you? So the components of trauma-informed care include physical and emotional safety, trustworthiness, choice, collaboration, and empowerment through an anti-oppression lens. What kinds of service providers should utilize a trauma-informed approach? Healthcare workers, mental health workers, social workers, disability service workers, advocates, so any kind of advocate, educators or school workers, child welfare and family support, legal and the justice system, first responders, community organizations, people who work in substance treatment, and maybe everyone. Anybody who works with individuals who've been through something should look at everything through a trauma-informed lens. We're going to talk about adapting practices. We're going to start with accessibility. So we work very closely with Disability Rights Arizona. And the ADA regulations say that the Americans with Disabilities Act is a civil rights law that prohibits discrimination against individuals who have disabilities in all areas of public life. So, including employment, education, transportation, and public accommodation. The ADA law was signed in 1990 and has since been amended to expand its protections. The ADA prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability and requires that employers, businesses, and government entities provide reasonable accommodations to individuals who have disabilities and make sure that they ensure equal access and opportunities to everyone. The ADA also mandates accessibility standards for public accommodations and commercial facilities such as restaurants, hotels, and stores to ensure that people with disabilities can access these spaces. So when we talk about accommodations, we're talking about adding accessibility and flexibility. For example, having physical access to buildings and written content. There are communication methods that ensure individuals with disabilities can participate fully. So for example, ramps, large print, plain language writing, elevators, screen readers, captioning, ASL interpretation, which I'd love to call out our wonderful interpreters, Cindy and Erica. Thank you for this. CART services, materials in common languages for the organization's demographic, and alternative formats for materials. And also having the ability to meet the needs of everyone. So potentially like changing the times of day you're available to meet, meeting off-site, or having other non-traditional communication methods like virtual meetings. When we talk about intake processes, ideally we're going to get to know the individual and we can support their needs and connect them to all of the available resources. During intake, hopefully we also are introducing our services, limits or boundaries, such as confidentiality, privileged communication, mandatory reporting, and individuals with disabilities might require special considerations. For example, they may need extra time, they may need to have their caregiver with them, or you may have to ask their caregiver to give them space and head out. They might need physical accessibility, so make sure the office space is accessible. They may need plain language accessibility or even other accommodations. And we are going to talk about accommodations. During intake processes with individuals who have intellectual disabilities, their history often does not include mention of previous sexual assaults or incidents. Individuals with developmental disabilities are more likely to be sexually assaulted when they have a history of assault. It's ideal to ask the questions out loud. Has anyone ever touched you and you didn't like it? Has anyone ever touched your private areas? Did anyone ever make you touch their private areas? Utilize comprehension tools if needed, so pictures or diagrams. You can have an anatomical chart, and to best clarify, you can have them point and touch. Ask how they felt when someone touched them. It's very important to comprehend. People might have sensory needs, so we need to be able to adjust light levels, and the individual needs to be able to choose where they sit and how they sit. And we need to be able to control the volume of noise nearby or provide earplugs. Also, a very helpful tool are the white noise machines to drown out office noises. Next, we're going to talk about safety. So structural and emotional safety. We need to think about what our building looks like. Are all of our signs clear and readable with large font? Is it sans serif font where we can read it? Is the parking lot well lit? Is lighting indoors appropriately soft for light sensitivity? What accessibility symbols does the entrance display? Does it show anything here on the left? Are there escape routes that are free of obstacles? ACESDV has a barrier removal safety enhancement plan tool to self-evaluate your building. It is in the same place where all of our best practices toolkits are online. Please use that if you want to check for accessibility. When we're providing safety to someone, what does it mean to be in a safe relationship with someone we're providing service to? Hopefully, we're going to be consistent with them. We're going to be predictable, non-violent, non-shaming, non-blaming, and respectful. We're going to provide consistent support and have backups in place that the person is aware of. So when I'm not here, you will talk to this person. We need to be able to be predictable and let them know what's going to happen at their next visit. We need to be able to meet in private and provide a clear written policy on confidentiality. We need to make sure our staff is attuned to signs of discomfort or distress from clients, and that when they show this, that they know how to respond. We need to normalize the client's reactions or statements without overgeneralizing. And learn to stay regulated as a staff member. A dysregulated person cannot help regulate another dysregulated person. We need to have healthy boundaries with folks. So as much as we want to be close friends, we can't always be close friends. It's important to alleviate potential burnout or close attachment. We need to recognize our roles, know how and be able to explain to other staff members or responders' roles, and be aware of differences between being friends and friendly, and know when to tag in for help. When we talk about trust with folks, we're going to talk about establishing trust. So provide an explanation to all of your clients about your role. Define it for them. Provide open and transparent communication. Maintain and protect each client's confidentiality, and make sure we share in the beginning mandatory reporting obligations. We need to build rapport with clients, show genuine empathy, recognize physical and emotional safety needs, convey belief in what the client is saying, address client questions and concerns. It's okay and sometimes helpful to say, I don't know, but I will find out. Providing an opportunity for clients to evaluate the services they receive and provide feedback to you can be really helpful. We want to offer them a choice of where to sit, where to meet, and respect and fully support the healthcare and justice decisions they make. And we need to offer clients options. So, saying things like, here are some ideas. What do you think? There's lots of different cultures of people that we're going to be working with. We need to be considerate of different cultures. For example, we may have immigrant survivors or Latina survivors. We might have LGBTQ plus survivors or survivors with disabilities, survivors with intellectual or developmental disabilities, survivors who are deaf, hard of hearing, or deafblind. We may have Indigenous survivors, male survivors, Black survivors, people who are in college, survivors of intimate partner violence as well. We may have older survivors, or we may have adults who were also assaulted as children. We need to do our homework and research different cultures or diagnoses. When you have a culture you're not familiar with, do some research. Attend trainings or events that encompass various types of clients or intersections. And of course, ACESDV gives lots of trainings. If you ever needed training, we're here for you. When we were trying to empower clients, we need to work with them to solve problems. It's not our job to solve anybody's problems, but we need to validate their feelings and choices, even when we don't agree with them. We need to highlight and focus on client strengths as we see them, and promote healing and growth, and provide opportunities to clients, such as an advisor to the agency, or to have them participate in programming planning. We also need to be looking through an anti-oppression lens. So anybody who's had pre-sexual violence and trauma and oppression, we need to look at that based on their race, their gender identity, their sexual orientation, their class or socioeconomic status. And we need to recognize that healing looks different for everyone and remain attentive to the unique needs and strengths of each survivor. Survivors are the experts in their own life, and there's no way or clean linear process to healing. So we need to recognize for advocacy, a good advocate is a good listener. They're compassionate, informed, open-minded, inclusive, flexible, and creative. But what they're not a rescuer. They're not a fixer. They can't work miracles. They're not a white knight or a superhero. They don't blame and they don't patronize. Next, we're going to talk about self-care for service providers. So thinking about what is vicarious trauma or secondary trauma. These are terms that are used to describe the negative psychological consequences that people in the helping professions, such as victim advocacy or disability work, may experience as a result of being exposed to a survivor's account of trauma and witnessing the survivor's pain and suffering. We have other trainings about this. So we have vicarious trauma training and burnout prevention training. So look at that one as well. We do have resources and support networks for you, though. So ACESDV started a grant program called Grand Canyon Collaborative. This is through the Office of Violence Against Women. We completed a statewide needs assessment in 2023. We created Best Practices Toolkit, which is where you found this training. And we also have 6 awesome resources. So besides our own selves, the people who worked with us, the Arizona Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing, the Arizona Developmental Disabilities Planning Council, the Arizona Statewide Independent Living Council, Disability Rights Arizona, and the ARC of Arizona. All 5 of those places are amazing resources. And please utilize our Barrier Removal Safety Enhancement Plan to self-evaluate your organization's ability to work at the intersection of sexual violence and disability. It has 4 evaluation tools in it. One of those tools is a competency for sexual or domestic violence organizations who serve individuals living with disabilities. One of them is a tool for competency for disability organizations who serve survivors, which maybe they don't say we serve survivors, but chances are they're going to end up serving some survivors. There's a tool for educational organizations and state and territory coalitions who provide trainings. And there's a tool for structural safety and access for both indoor and outdoor if you have a building. ACESDV will provide support to you as you use this tool. And in the future, funding may be available to help improve your processes or purchase necessary equipment. As previously mentioned, please reach out to me if you have any questions. My email address is carrie@acesdv.org.